Before we dig into the meat of issues, I think the most important question I have to ask before we get into the philosophy of language, logic, and epistemology is how you pronounce a priori and a posteriori.
Well, I guess I prefer a priori and a posteriori to a priori and a posteriori, but
Okay.
yeah.
That is my feeling as well, because a priori just sounds too stiff, and maybe it's an aesthetic choice, but a priori just kind of rolls nicely off the tongue.
Well, there you go. It would have been the original pronunciation. So.
And then second, more substantive perhaps, is how philosophers have generally defined and distinguished these two terms. And it might be helpful to hear some paradigm cases in which they've been relevant in, say, ethics or epistemology come to mind.
Right. So, the distinction in some sense, although it sounds like a technical distinction, is something that I think even non-philosophers could warm up to quite easily, because it does look as though there are very clear-cut cases of things that you know just by thinking about them, versus things that you can't know just by thinking about them, but you have to open your eyes and go and look. So, for instance, it's sunny. You can't know that just by thinking about it. You've got to kind of go and check and see whether it's sunny or not. It's true that you could maybe, if you're living in a place where it's normally sunny, assume that it's sunny without looking on that occasion. You would be using something called induction from past cases, which itself is based on prior observation. So it's sunny is something that you can only know by having some kind of access to sensory experience. Versus if it's sunny, then it's sunny, which is a kind of, sounds like a trivial logical truth, but which it is, but it's nevertheless something that is true. I pick it just because it's so clearly something that you don't need to go and experiment in order to figure out whether it's true.
And you don't need to know classical logic.
It's just obviously true, and true just by thinking about it. Now, of course, there are so that gives you an intuitive grip on the distinction. And of course, what's really interesting is that you can then, if you consider cases, know very quickly where they belong. So for example, if I say a square has four sides, well, that seems to belong on the a priori side of things. And if I say all wooden tables are squares, that would require going and checking, and it's probably false, right? In fact, we know it's false because we've seen some wooden tables that are not squares. And so on for many, many other, in fact, for virtually every case that you could think of, you would have some very strong feeling about whether it belongs on the a priori side or the a posteriori side. And when there is this kind of non-collusive convergence on how a distinction is to be applied to cases, that in itself is very strong reason to believe that the distinction is a real one. Now, you're onto something. Now, we might have to work very hard to explain exactly what you're onto, how to clarify the distinction in the ways that are required for it to be a sound and distinction that's central to epistemology. But you can have every confidence that your work is justified, because it's intuitively clear that we're onto a real distinction. But of course, nothing is so clear or obvious that philosophers haven't denied it. And so, strangely enough, it's become the source of a great deal of controversy, whether the distinction is sufficiently clear, whether if it's sufficiently clear, it's actually real, and even if it's real, whether it is important.